Hello and welcome to the Tennessee Informer. Thank you for all for being with us tonight. If you've watched this show for any length of time at all, you know that I take a pro-Confederate view of the war for Southern independence and that it is generally reflected in the guests I invite to be on the program. It is my belief that the South had the right to secede just as their fathers and grandfathers had seceded from Great Britain during the founding generation. Many of the most prominent members of that generation were from the South, such as Washington, Jefferson, and many others. The Confederacy, which, by the way, Madison referred to the government created by the Constitution of 1787 as a confederation, was designed to maintain the form of government created by the founders, meaning the bulk of the powers were retained by the states and the federal government only exercised limited and delegated powers. The fight over the limited government created and ratified by the states, as opposed to the consolidated government that Hamilton and others hoped to create, began soon after ratification. The war between the states was ultimately the result of those two very different viewpoints. Notice that the South wanted to secede, not to take over or force its will on the North. The Confederate Constitution drew clear lines on the limits of federal power in the Confederacy. And maybe, just maybe, the Confederacy would have been successful in their attempt at independence if the generals had listened to the advice of one man. And that man is Nathan Bedford Forrest, a much unfairly maligned character in history that Southerners and Tennesseans in particular should be extremely proud of for his leadership abilities and repeated successes on the battlefield. His strategies were actually studied by our own military. And oh, by the way, he led the way on reconciliation after the war to include promoting the progress of former slaves. But you won't hear that truth allowed to be taught by today's elite. Our guest tonight is Gene Andrews, who's been with us a few times before, and we're glad to welcome him back. He works at the recently restored boyhood home of Nathan Bedford Forrest. He's here to tell us how some battles may have turned out differently if only they had listened to Nathan Bedford Forrest. We'll get to Gene and all that in just a minute. But first, it's time for the Informer Report. Okay, unless you've been living under a rock, you know that there's a special election in the 7th District tomorrow in Tennessee. This has been all over the news. You know, we hear President Trump is chiming in on it, others, and the mission is to get out the vote, preferably for Matt Van Epps. That's their preferred candidate. And he is running against a far left, a flat-out commie, a crazy commie, Afton Bain. And this woman is as crazy as any Democrat communist anywhere in this country. New York, California, Illinois, you name it. She is a whack job. And, you know, we have two options on our side, so to speak. We have Matt Van Epps, the Republican nominee, and we have also John Thorpe, an independent candidate. Now, a lot of people are not happy about Van Epps being the nominee. He's not somebody I supported. The establishment pushed him very hard, and I think that's turned a lot of people off, and understandably. Conservatives are disgusted by the way this was pushed. Personally, I think Trump should have stayed out of it, especially in the primaries. And we definitely don't like all the out-of-state money that was used not only to promote Van Epps, but to push against the most grassroots-supported candidate, Jody Barrett. And so the fear is that disgusted conservatives will either stay home tomorrow. Some may vote for independent candidate John Thorpe, and you can make your own decision on that, but the bottom line is we cannot afford to allow the Dems to take this seat. We have a very, very, very narrow margin in the House. And, we got in this situation, there's a couple different things that really you have to ask how this happened. Well, number one, this immediate situation was created by Mark Green. When the Night Stalkers that don't quit, well, they apparently do. If you get a better offer for a job, business, whatever, then even though you ran for office, were elected, you can quit early on in your term. And now this is what we're dealing with. So that's the immediate reason that we're in this situation. But the thought that a far left Democrat, a communist, could be elected in this district especially. I mean, it's bad enough anywhere in Tennessee, but in this district, I mean, that's a failure. The fact that we have people that think that way in our state, it's a failure of our state. It's really a failure of all those people who have, excuse me, have not taught their, it's a failure of our schools to teach about our government. Okay, sorry about that. Had to clear something up. It seemed to be good now. Anyway, it's disgraceful that somebody like Bain could even consider running in the state of Tennessee. And it's concerning that we have to worry that we might actually lose this seat. Now, we won't really know how everything turns out till tomorrow. But there's another aspect of this that we need to be concerned about. And we're going to play a little clip here in just a minute. And this clip, it's from Alyssa Rosenheck. She is a Nashville-based best-selling author and advocate whose forthcoming book, White Blonde Jew, tackles the very issues that are highlighted in this video. Because you want to see some of the other people that Afton Bain is working with and whose support she has, you need to take a look at this and listen and think about this when you go to vote tomorrow. And make sure that you share this to some of your friends who are friends or family who may lean Democrat. They need to know about this. So let's go ahead and roll the tape real quick.
Do you all remember last summer, Metro Council member Zulfat Swara, who directly pulled a resolution from the USCPR, which is an alleged tax-exempt shelter for terrorism? Well, guess who she's been campaigning for? Afton Bain. And I want you to see exactly who they both align themselves with. And here's the part that nobody wants to say out loud. Political Islam doesn't need bullets when they have ballots, and a steady supply of progressive women like Afton Bain cosplaying 2020, driven by white guilt rather than discernment. Just watch.
Hi everyone, this is Zulfat, and I want to encourage you all to get out and go vote. I actually heard a saying not too long ago that everybody votes, whether you go to the polls or not. See, if you do not go vote, somebody else is making a decision for you and they're voting for you and making a choice for you. So you don't want that. You want to be the one selecting and electing the people that you want there, not letting them do it for you. So especially for Tennessee Congressional Seat 7, trust me on this one. You want Afton. I want Afton. Let's get it done.
This is exactly how political Islam and the Islamification of America takes root, not through dramatic headlines, but through city seats and state seats. This is where socialism within the progressive left and political Islam merge and walk straight into our American backyards and erode the very cities we love and continue to build. So please, Nashville, vote wisely this week.
Once again, that is Alyssa Rosenheck, best-selling author in Nashville. She has an Instagram page. Go and visit it. Her book, White Blonde Jew, will be out this spring. We will have her on the show sometime in the future. But did you notice all of those people that Afton is affiliated with? And Zura, I cannot recall her last name. Did you see the connections? I mean, it's not really a surprise that Afton Bain has the Death to America Democrat vote locked up. That's no surprise. But we've got to make sure that we get people out to vote tomorrow. We cannot afford to lose this to the Dems. And pay attention what she said about them using the ballot. This is the Red-Green Alliance. We've talked about it on this show before. We've talked about the other woman in the picture, the large black lady who may very well run for mayor of Nashville in the future. So guys, they are organized, and we have to push back on this. You can't fix stupid. We have to outvote it. But it's a scary time. Get everybody out there tomorrow, and let's make sure that we do not lose this to Afton Bain. A couple of other things here for our Informer report. I want to hit this again. Morons for the millionaires in the governor's race. Now, this is a reference to those people who think that because Monty Fritz is not a millionaire and doesn't have the kind of money that Marsha Blackburn has and the name recognition or the kind of money that John Rose has, that he's just not a viable candidate. So these same people, a lot of these people, will complain about people like Marsha, people like Rose, people from the swamp. They'll complain about them. But when they have a real alternative who just doesn't have endless zeros behind his name, then they're like, oh, well, he's not viable. And so they're going to vote for one of the lesser two evils instead of supporting a candidate who most of them would agree with. I mean, the things I hear Monty say are the things that most conservatives have wanted all these years. So especially if you're not willing to donate some of your money to the Fritz campaign, then to say that, well, he doesn't have a chance because he doesn't have any money, I mean, that's one of those self-fulfilling prophecies. Bottom line is, vote your values and don't be a moron for millionaires. Are we going to have a war in Venezuela? Let's hope not. You know, it's hard to tell what's going to happen. I just wish that the administration was as focused on, and they have done a good job of securing our border, but I wish they put a little more emphasis on getting rid of the people in our country, like the people that, like the person that killed the National Guard soldier and seriously wounded another soldier, West Virginia National Guardsman in D.C. last week. That should be the push. Now, to his credit, he said he is going to review all of the people that were brought over here under Biden, beginning with the Afghanis. I hope that happens. I hope it's fast. I hope it's furious. There's nothing, you can't vet those people. Those people just need to be sent out of the country. There's no way to vet an Afghani. And I heard today Kristi Noem said that she somehow suspected that this guy was radicalized after he got to the States. Now, some concerning things. He did work with the CIA when he was in Afghanistan. So one question is, why was he not being watched? Seems like they would have kept tabs on him. But the fact that he got radicalized after he got here, if that is true, not surprising. Islam is a radical. It's not just a religion, it's an ideology. And so I hope he cracks down on this. Venezuela, if we're going to have a war with Venezuela, can we at least involve Congress? Yes, I know Congress is terrible, but you know, we do have a constitution. And whatever we allow Trump to do on his own, and I have no sympathy for drug dealers, assuming that's what they are, but we haven't been given a lot of information in this whole situation. And our Constitution does not allow the president, even if it's our guy, to just go blowing boats out of the water without some kind of input from Congress, as sorry as Congress is. And I have to wonder, you know, if it's because they're carrying drugs. Well, my understanding is that China was bringing in most of the fentanyl to Mexico that was coming over here. Does that mean we're going to start shooting at Chinese boats, Chinese ships as they come over here? So it's crazy. It just seems to me like the last thing we need is to get involved in another war at this point in time. And it does seem to me that there needs to be more outrage over the murder of the National Guard soldier and the serious wounding of the other National Guard soldier by the people in this country who are I will call them the hate Israel crowd. Now, I understand not everybody that disagrees with Israel is an anti-Semite. I understand that. But it just seems to me like there's still so many people that are just focused on Israel when we had this murder in D.C. last week of a National Guard soldier by an Islamist. When are we ever going to treat the Islamist the way they deserve to be treated? When are we ever going to view them as the threat that they are? You know, nobody's worried about Israel sneaking over the border in the middle of the night and slaughtering us, but we do worry about Islamic terrorism. because that's what they do. That is, when they're not mobilizing politically and beating us with ballots. We have to watch out for that as well. So hopefully we will finally see Islam for the threat that it is, and we will actually start doing something about it. That's it for this installment of the Informer Report. If you have a news story that you want to alert us to, be sure to send us an email at tninformer.tv@gmail.com. Before we bring on our guest tonight, Gene, there is a word from our sponsor.
Light, the energy of life itself. Since the beginning of time, light has sustained us, fueled our growth, and shaped the world. Even Einstein recognized that everything we are is made of light. But what if we could harness the light within us, not just to live, but to renew, restore, and rejuvenate? Introducing LifeWave X39, the first product in the world that activates stem cells using our body's own light. Backed by clinical research, multiple patents, and over 10 years of stem cell research, a revolutionary wearable light technology that unlocks the power of activating our own stem cells with a single, safe, affordable, non-transdermal patch that puts you back in control of how you look, feel, and perform. Unlike drugs or chemicals, X39 works naturally, awakening your body's ability to heal and thrive. It's time to unlock your full potential, restore your vitality, and embrace a healthier, more vibrant you.
And now to our guest, Gene Andrews. Gene, thanks for being with us. How are you doing tonight?
Doing very well, Dave. Thank you very much for having me on the program. I appreciate it.
Always glad to have you. How are things going at Chapel Hill?
Going very well. We're still working on trying to get that visitor center built. And unfortunately, some of our leadership in the SCV has been stalling it. But maybe we'll be out there in the snow and sleet this winter and finally get something started. So we got the money, and then just turn us loose.
Now, Chapel Hill, for those of you that don't know, is the boyhood home of Forrest. And
Yes, sir.
You've worked out there for how long now?
Well, started back in the early 90s and just kind of on a volunteer basis. And then in 1997, the Sons of Confederate Veterans acquired the property. It was given to us by the state of Tennessee. And they were going to fix the property and the 58 acres out there as a little satellite park of Henry Horton State Park. But then, of course, our good friends in the Legislative Black Racist Caucus started pitching a fit about spending money on anything Confederate, and the state just dropped it. And when I first started going down there, that house was just about gone. The tin roof had blown back, water was pouring in, all the windows had been broken out or shot out, and just covered up with weeds and trees around it. So the Sons of Confederate Veterans have done a really good job of getting the house restored, clearing the grounds, and having events there. So.
Well, he really was one of the greatest generals ever, and he had no formal military training at all, right?
No, sir. He did not go to West Point or VMI, the Citadel. He was just a natural born leader and had this inner drive and determination and an abundance of common sense. Forrest wasn't going to follow the book. And if the book said you're supposed to attack across open ground, he said, no way, we're swinging around behind them. Come in on the flank or come in behind them. So that was what made him such a great commander. And he was there with his men. And he understood that they had the quote by him. He said, never stand to receive the attack of the enemy. Always take the initiative and get there first with the most men. And it wasn't first with the most men on the battlefield. It was first at the critical point in the battle. And so many times he was at that critical point. He wasn't sitting way back somewhere in headquarters and, back in the rear with the gear. He was there on the field. He knew what the situation was, and he was right there to encourage his men or cuss them or chew them out or pat them on the back or kick them in the seat, whatever it took to get that critical point taken by his troopers.
Now, he signed up as a private, if I understand correctly. So how did he end up running a whole unit, being a general?
Yes, sir. He just volunteered and joined the Confederate Army, and he actually voted against secession. He thought it was bad for business. But Lee in Virginia was also against secession. But like Lee in Virginia, when their state voted to leave the Union, Lee and Forrest stayed with their state and joined the Confederate Army. He just walked in and enlisted as a private. He didn't stay a private very long. He was 40 years old. And I'm sure some of those teenagers in that first company of cavalry that he joined probably referred to him as Pops or Grandpa.
Once.
Once. You're right. They didn't do it very long because he knew Governor Isom G. Harris, and Governor Harris knew him, and he gave him a commission as a lieutenant colonel to raise his own mounted battalion at his own expense. The Confederate government couldn't pay for it. And so he did, and the rest, as they say, is history. He took off from there.
Well, let's hit some of the highlights of some of his famous victories, and then we'll hit some of the battles where they should have listened to him.
Yes, sir. There was an interesting book that came out several years ago by Dr. Samuel Mitchum down in Louisiana. It's called Bust Hell Wide Open. And that was Forrest's quote at Fort Donelson. When they brought him in and told him they were going to surrender the fort, he said, "I didn't bring my men here to surrender. We're going out of here tonight, even if we have to bust hell wide open." And in that book, Dr. Mitchum said, in the Western theater of the war, the West Point trained professional generals hardly ever won, while Forrest, the untrained amateur, hardly ever lost. And that is history, regardless of what they want to say. And they would not recognize his ability because he was not a member of that West Point club.
Wasn't a ring knocker.
They couldn't understand how somebody could be that successful and not have professional military training. But he knew how to recruit. He knew how to command situations. And during the course of the war, he never commanded more than about 3,000 to 5,000 men at one time. But he had 3 of his commands taken away from him and given to someone else. And during the entire course of the war, he probably commanded about 60,000 men, not at one time,
right,
but spread out over 4 years. So, and he commanded cavalry, which was his main unit that he was in charge of, infantry and artillery. So he could command all 3 of the combat arms, which is a pretty good deal. You knew what you were doing if you could do something like that.
Absolutely.
So,
now, you mentioned Donelson. Donelson is a lot more important than a lot of people realize.
Well, it opened up Tennessee to the Federal Army. When Fort Donelson was surrendered, and Forrest was there, and he had harassed Grant. Grant's army came down the Tennessee River and took Fort Henry on the Tennessee River. Well, actually, Admiral Foote's gunboats did. The fort was flooded out. But when Grant tried to cross that land between the lakes, or it's called the land between the rivers back then, Forrest harassed his army, held them up for several days, and then was driven back into Fort Donelson. On the morning of February 14th, the Confederates decided to launch a counterattack against the Federal Army and break open the road and get away to Clarksville, which they did. They caught Grant's army completely off guard and bent his lines back into a sharp V. Now they had a second option. Why not take everybody and throw them into this attack and drive Grant over the bluff and into the Cumberland River? And that's what Forrest was pushing for. He said, we've got them on the run. Don't ever let a defeated enemy give them time to recover. But the West Point trained generals came up with a third option that nobody saw coming. They turned around, marched back into the fort, and then that night they decided they were going to surrender to Grant.
They marched back to surrender. They marched back to Fort Donelson to surrender.
To surrender. That was it. They could have escaped. Forrest had the road open to Clarksville. They could have gotten out of there. But that's when they brought Forrest in and told him they were going to surrender. And that's when he gave them that quote, "I didn't bring my men here to surrender." So he took out his cavalry battalion, about 600 men. They had about 300 infantry that climbed up behind them and rode double and got out of there with them. To tell you what type of person Forrest was, they were riding out at night. Now, this is about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. And the column stopped. And he rode up to the head of the column and asked him, "Why'd you stop?" And he said, "Well, sir, this creek is frozen. We don't know how deep it is." And Forrest said, "Well, we'll find out." He put the spurs to his horse, jumped his horse off the bank, hit the ice, broke the ice, and the water only came up to the saddle skirt, so he let him out. He was not going to ask an enlisted man to do something that he was unwilling to do himself. So that was one battle where he gave advice to the commanding officers. It was ignored. We lost the fort. We lost 15,000 prisoners. What would have an extra 15,000 have been able to do to defend Nashville and keep it from falling into enemy hands so early in the war? Or what would another 15,000 done at the next big battle he was in April down at Shiloh or Pittsburgh Landing? And once again, it was Forrest cavalry that was out on the flank, capturing artillery, capturing prisoners. The Confederates were successful that first day, drove the Federal Army back to the Pittsburgh Landing. Forrest and his men put on captured Union overcoats, crept along the riverbank at night, and saw that Buell's army had come down from Nashville and was being ferried across the river to reinforce Grant. He sent word back to the Confederate commanding officers, said, "We need to do something. They're being reinforced. We'll be outnumbered tomorrow." And they ignored him. Sure enough, Grant's army, now double the size of the Confederate army, attacked on the second day of Shiloh, drove the Confederates off the field and back to Corinth.
Who were the commanders, the Confederate commanders there that ignored Forrest?
Well, the first one was Albert Sidney Johnston, but then he got shot that day. A bullet hit him in the back of the leg and severed an artery. And he passed out, and they couldn't find the wound. They took open his coat, and they thought he was hit in the chest or somewhere, until all of a sudden they saw this blood running out of his boot, and by then it was too late. He'd bled out. Then it went to General Beauregard and also Braxton Bragg. And this was where a long-running feud between Bragg and Forrest began. There were so many times that, in my reading, there were so many occasions that Forrest had a concept of what should be done on the field or what should be done in the entire theater of war. They called it the Western Theater, which was from the Appalachian Mountains all the way over to the Mississippi River. And Forrest knew how to defeat these larger federal armies without ever fighting them head to head. He was constantly outnumbered. He couldn't stop Grant or Sherman or Rosecrans in a head-to-head battle. He simply swung around behind them and cut their supply lines, tore up railroad tracks, burned trains, burned wagon trains, took their supplies from them. He stopped Grant's first attempt at Vicksburg was down through Mississippi. Forrest crossed the Tennessee River, destroyed the Mobile and Ohio Railroad, and Earl Van Dorn burned Grant's supply depot at Holly Springs. Grant turned around and went back to Memphis. So his first attempt at Vicksburg was a failure. And he had to wait for a Navy flotilla to be built to escort him down the Mississippi River and try to take Vicksburg from the Mississippi Riverside. He stopped Rosecrans and Buell. They were going to Chattanooga at different times to take out that railroad junction, which would pretty much split the Confederacy in half right there. Forrest just swung around behind him, tore up track at Murfreesboro, captured two Union regiments that were there, and then he released prisoners that morning. And this was on his 41st birthday, July 13th, 1862. Quite a birthday present. That's better than an ugly tie and socks. Okay, there. So he actually released Southern civilians that were in the jail at Murfreesboro that were going to be executed that morning because they had aided the enemy. Yes, they did. They gave food and clothing to their sons.
Right.
And because of that, they rounded up the men were going to execute them. The jailers set fire to the jail and ran off with the keys. And Forrest's men got in there and pried the bars open, got them out, and finally put out the fire. So Forrest's men saved the town of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, from being burned down. Wow. And the university at Murfreesboro, Middle Tennessee State University, is nicknamed the Raiders. They had Forrest Hall was the name of the ROTC building there, and they have tried for years and years and years to get that name taken off of the ROTC building. They don't want Forrest Hall there.
They should be proud of that name. They should be proud that, they're here in Tennessee and that's where Forrest came from. It's ridiculous. I want to go back to Shiloh for just a second.
Yes, sir.
So Johnson is out of the picture now. And I take it that Bragg was the ranking general, and then Beauregard?
Beauregard. Pierre Gustave Beauregard.
Okay,
took over.
Okay, so and he didn't have a good relationship with Forrest?
Well, Beauregard, once again, he wasn't going to listen to a lieutenant colonel, and he wasn't a West Pointer. How did this guy know how to fight a battle? It just common sense. That's what he had.
Right.
And there were so many times he advised the commander on the field. And then later on in the war, he actually wrote to Richmond and gave him an outline of how to defeat these armies in the West. He wrote to Samuel Cooper, who was the adjutant general. He was the highest ranking officer in the Confederacy, higher than Lee, Jackson, Stonewall Jackson, or any of them. He was the adjutant general. Explained the situation. They asked, at that time, Forrest was serving under Braxton Bragg, and they asked Braxton Bragg for his opinion, and Bragg hated Forrest because Forrest told the truth. And he advised Bragg what to do after the battle at Chickamauga. The Confederates, one of the few big victories they won in the West. The Federal Army had been routed off the field at Chickamauga, ran back up over Missionary Ridge and back down into Chattanooga. Forrest was hot on their heels, and he got up to Missionary Ridge, and there was an officer up on top of a lookout tower with a big telescope. He couldn't get down in time. Forrest ordered him to come down. Forrest climbed up on this tower, looked down into Chattanooga, and saw the confusion and disorder and demoralization of the Federal Army. And Forrest had his men wearing out horses, getting back to Bragg and telling him, bring the army up. We need to attack them right now. And they're disorganized. We can destroy this army, drive them into the Tennessee River. Bragg wouldn't do it. He said, the army's too fatigued. We can't do it. And Forrest said, yeah, but the Yankee army's fatigued too.
Right. And
they're demoralized and defeated. And even if you're tired, you can always defeat another army that's tired and demoralized.
Right.
So it was ignored. They were reinforced in Chattanooga. In November, Grant and Sherman drove the Confederates off of Missionary Ridge, Lookout Mountain, retreated back down into Georgia. So it's really sad in a way how many times Forrest had a clear idea of what needed to be done in a battle, and the professional officers ignored him. And it wasn't really recognized till the end of the war. After the war, President Davis said, well, I was misled. I just thought he was a raider, and that he couldn't command large numbers of troops. And Robert E. Lee had the right idea, though. After the war, Lee was president of Washington College. And somebody asked Lee, who was the greatest man produced by either side in the recent war? And Lee said, the greatest man produced by either side, a man I've never met, Bedford Forrest of Tennessee. That's a pretty good endorsement right there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And maybe if they had been in the same theater, maybe Lee probably would have made better use of him.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Was there anybody in the hierarchy that was like, yeah, hey, listen to Forrest, or allowed him to do what he wanted to do? I understand he did act on his own. I guess he was in charge at Bryce's Crossroads, which we talked about before we got started.
Exactly. That was termed that as the perfect battle. He took 3,800 men and defeated an army of over 8,000. And not only did he defeat them, he routed them off the field. He captured 20 of their 22 pieces of artillery, and he captured all 250 of their wagons that they were using to rob the civilians in northern Mississippi. And it took General Sturgis over 2 weeks to get from Memphis down to Bryce's Crossroads. And the map there shows that Forrest used the terrain. He said that we will attack them. The woods are so thick and heavy, they won't know how few of us there are. And they'll send back for the infantry to come up a narrow, muddy road. It's been raining. It's going to be, and his quote was, it's going to be hot as hell today. And he said, they'll arrive to the field worn out, and then we'll ride right over them. And that's exactly how they fought the battle and won it. And one of the classic quotes of the war came from the Federal General Sturgis, on this retreat back to Memphis. And his officers were urging him, sir, we need to make a stand. And he said, no. If Mr. Forrest, not General Forrest, but if Mr. Forrest will just leave me alone, I will leave him alone. And Forrest wasn't about to leave him alone. They stayed after them, the pursuit all the way back to Memphis. And it was so bad, and the Confederates were worn out. They'd been riding all over Mississippi to come to that point for the battle, and then fought a full day's battle, and then pursuit night and day for 2 days. Forrest was riding along, and he went to sleep in the saddle, and his horse went to sleep.
Oh, wow.
And some of his staff officers said, I think you better wake him up. And they're going, I'm not going to do it. You better go wake him up. And so the horse wandered off the road and bumped into a tree and kind of bolted. And Forrest woke up and got the horse back on the road, and here they went after him again. So
Wow.
he knew how to fight a battle, and he knew how to finish a battle. That was the main thing. He was like a bulldog. Once he got his teeth into somebody, he was not going to let go of them.
And even though he never had any formal training, he obviously knew how to use the terrain.
Yes, sir.
And he knew, okay, hey, the weather is going to be a factor. The roads are going to be slick. It's going to be hot. They're going to be tired. And that's all to our advantage.
Absolutely. That was it. And you'd shown a picture a few slides ago about the artillery. He had Captain Morton's battery and Captain Rice's battery there. Those Confederates hand rolled those cannons for over 3 miles that day. Not at one time, but they would pick them up, roll them forward, double load them with canister, and blast holes in the Federal lines. This was called by some historians the first modern tank battle, because that's basically what a tank does. It's artillery mounted on tracks.
Right.
It clanks along and blasts a hole in the enemy lines, and then the foot soldiers, the infantry, come in right behind him. But Forrest had this concept down long before 1914, when tanks were first used in World War I. He used his artillery like we use tanks today. And they think, and they hadn't been able to prove this, that during the 1930s, German generals, two of them, Erwin Rommel and Hans Guderian, came to the United States and were in that area. And there's General Rommel right there.
Right.
We're in that area to study Forrest tactics. And there were some people who said, yes, we talked to some German officers that were here. They didn't know who it was, but they think that Rommel and Guderian were over here studying Forrest tactics and applied that to their panzer divisions with the German army back in Europe.
Yeah, I've heard that before. I assumed it was true. And I know that our West Point and other military installations or other military type institutions have studied him, and it didn't used to be an issue. It was, hey, he's an American that was a great general, even though he didn't have any formal West Point training, and so they looked at what he did during these battles.
Yes, sir. And it's interesting comments that were made about him. He was the only officer in the war that had a bounty put on his head. General Sherman said, Forrest must be hunted down and killed or captured if it bankrupts the Treasury and we lose 10,000 men. They have to take Forrest out. Because here's the situation in the spring of 1864. Chattanooga had fallen. Grant had gone east to command the Army of the Potomac against Lee. Sherman was put in charge of the main Federal Army in the West at Chattanooga. It didn't take a genius to look at a map and say the next objective is going to be Atlanta, coming down the Western and Atlantic Railroad between Chattanooga and Atlanta. And what Sherman was afraid of was that Forrest was going to get behind him into Tennessee and take out the two railroads, the Nashville and Decatur, Nashville down to Decatur, Alabama, and Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad, which in a summer campaign would leave Sherman stranded in North Georgia because they couldn't use the Tennessee River for these big supply boats, steamboats in the summer because of Muscle Shoals, Alabama. Wheeler Dam hadn't been built yet, and the river would get low in the summertime, and you get rowboats and canoes over it, but you couldn't get these big steamboats up over Muscle Shoals. So Sherman had to depend on the railroads. And so if Forrest got loose in Tennessee and took out the railroads, just like he had done against Grant, the Mobile and Ohio Railroad, Sherman would be stuck in North Georgia and no way to get back to Tennessee or get back to any of his supply bases that he had in Tennessee. So Sherman and the Federal Army recognized Forrest's talent much more than the Confederate Army and the Confederate government did. They were deathly afraid of him. So that's why they, in the spring and summer of 1864, they sent 4 armies out of Memphis into northern Mississippi. And they hoped they could kill or capture Forrest. Even if they couldn't, they would keep him pinned down in Mississippi. Yep. And while Sherman was making his move down from Atlanta to Tunnel Hill, Georgia, Resaca, Kennesaw Mountain, and then finally down to Atlanta itself. So the irony of the whole situation is that the Federal Army recognized Forrest more than the Confederate military and the Confederate government did. So,
It's kind of granted, they didn't have Fox News, they didn't have the internet, so they couldn't really get any. But it's still kind of strange that somebody on our side didn't recognize, hey, we need to make more use of this guy. And if nothing else, we need to listen to him a little more.
well, that was Forrest's whole strategy of the war. I mean, he was not some just redneck, dirt farmer from out in the weeds somewhere. He got the concept of what we needed to do. He knew that the South could never win a conventional war, because we could win battles,
Right.
and we would have 5,000 losses. The Yankees would have 10,000 losses, and we couldn't replace but maybe 800 or 900 out of our losses.
Right.
They would take their 10,000 losses and replace it with 15 or 20,000.
Yeah.
So as long as we kept fighting conventional battles, even if we won, eventually it was going to get down to a war of attrition.
Yeah.
And that's exactly how Grant defeated Lee.
Yeah.
He had an army that outnumbered Lee 2-1 in the wilderness campaign, the wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, and Grant lost more men in casualties than Lee had in his entire army. But he pushed the Confederates back to the earthworks around Richmond and Petersburg and eventually just wore them out. But Forrest understood we can't win a war like that. Yeah. We can win battles. Lee won a lot of battles. But the concept of the Confederate government was, in Richmond, they needed to throw everything they had into one big battle, destroy the Army of the Potomac, and then march on Washington, threaten Washington, D.C., and sue for peace and get some kind of peace recognition for the Confederate States. Looked good on paper, and Lee won a lot of battles. Right. He won Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Second Manassas, all these battles. But he could never completely destroy the Army of the Potomac and could never threaten Richmond. So Forrest understood that. You're wasting your time, you're wasting your men, you're wasting lives that we don't have.
Right.
I mean, 21 million in the North, there are 9 million in the South, and 3 million of those were slaves. Right. So there's no way we could win a war of attrition. You make it hard for the armies to move, to come into the South. The further they come into the South, the more targets we have to go after.
Right, right. Well, and of course, they had the population, they had the native population difference in terms of numbers, but you had all of these recent immigrants from Europe and a lot of the 48ers. Yes. Can you talk about the 48ers a little bit that fought for the Union?
Yes. And somebody says, well, Andrews, you got it wrong. It's the 49ers out of California. No, the 48ers were socialists. And they had tried socialist revolutions in Europe, and they had failed. And they had to hightail it out of Europe before they were executed or thrown in prison. They wound up in this country, and they were welcomed by the Lincoln government.
Yep.
A lot of the regiments in the Federal Army in the East, they couldn't speak English. They spoke German. Franz Siegel, a lot of them, like I said, they were bringing them over here by the boatload. They told the poor Irish that were going through another famine caused by the British taking all the food out of Ireland. They said, oh, come to America and we'll give you jobs on the railroad. So they brought all these poor Irishmen over here and said, now, in order to get jobs on the railroad, you have to be an American citizen. So, Patty, hold up your right hand and swear to defend the Constitution, et cetera, et cetera. Don't fold, bend, staple, or mutilate, whatever. And said, okay, now you're American citizens. They said, oh, great, we get jobs on the railroad. And they go, not quite. Since you're an American citizen, now you're eligible for the draft. And you've just been drafted or conscripted into the U.S. Army. Yeah. But what about the jobs on the railroad? They said, oh, you're going to be on the railroad, all right, but you're going to the killing fields in Virginia. Yeah. So, yeah, and that's where a lot of those 48ers came from, that were on Lincoln's cabinet, high positions in the government. That was the start of bringing socialism and eventually communism into this country. And you go forward to the Frankfurt School in Germany and what all that brought over here. So thanks a lot, Abe, for bringing that over here. We really appreciate that.
One of the things you hear all the time in the news today, and it's people like O'Reilly and Mark Levin and all these other clowns, and they want to draw a direct line from the Democrats of the 1850s and 60s to the Democrats of today. But that's inaccurate. there's much more of a direct line from the GOP of the 1850s and 1860s to the Democrats of today than the other way around.
Yeah, they got it just backwards.
Yeah.
The Democrats in the 1800s were the conservative party.
Right.
They would have had the Donald Trump or the J.D. Vance or Strom Thurmond or all of these people, Pat Buchanan. They would have all been Democrats back then. And the Republicans back then were the nutcase party. I mean, they were really wackos. Trying to be Congresswoman from Nashville and AOC and Bernie Sanders and all of that crowd, they would have all been Republicans back then. And it was just by chance that Lincoln got elected. Lincoln only got 39% of the vote. Yep. And the reason he was elected president because the Democrats split between John Breckinridge in the South and Stephen Douglas in the North. Had either one of those joined forces together, Lincoln, we'd have never heard of this Abraham Lincoln guy.
Right.
So
right.
He had a different picture on the $5 bill.
Yeah. And, the thing, too, I hear them complaining, well, they wouldn't allow any Republicans in. Well, there was not a Republican Party in the South.
No.
I mean, so it's not like they weren't. There just wasn't one there. It was
it
was not a national party. It was a sectional party at the time.
Exactly. You're exactly right, Dave. And they didn't ban Lincoln from running in elections in the 1860 election. And that's the thing they always threw at us, and said, well, they banned President Lincoln from even running in the state. No, they didn't ban him. He couldn't get enough signatures to get on the ballot in 7 states. You have to have a minimum number of signatures to be, the Green Party or the whatever kind of party you're running on, socialist or whatever. He couldn't get enough signatures to even get on the ballot in 7 states.
Right.
So he wasn't banned. The Republicans were so radical, they wouldn't have anything to do with that. I mean, people weren't stupid. They didn't have CNN telling them what to do or Fox or anything, but they had heard about what this Republican Party was all about. And they said, we don't want any part of that.
Yeah, they were the big government party. They were the progressive, so-called progressive party at the time. And people don't want to hear that, but that's the historical fact. And they had the commies in them at the time, not the Democrats at the time. And of course, now today, the Democrats are communists. I don't care what you say. There's nobody in elected office as a Democrat today that is either not a communist or is okay with communism.
Exactly. So flip that over. That would have been the Republicans back in the 1800s. And even worse than that, as bad as that was, they were in charge of Reconstruction after the war, which is actually redestruction of stealing everything from the South that wasn't destroyed in the war.
Yep.
And bringing in the Franchise Act where Southerners couldn't vote. You couldn't vote for a sheriff. You couldn't vote for a tax assessor.
Right.
They armed the blacks and just turned them loose on the Southerners. Today it would be like taking the Crips and the Bloods and giving them AR-15s and said, all right, go out and kill as many white people as you can and run back here and hide under the Yankee flag. Nothing's going to happen to you. And they can't understand why the Republican Party was so hated in the South for over 100 years. I can remember as a little boy in the 50s and 60s, the only election that counted in Tennessee was the Democratic primary, because usually the Republicans wouldn't even run a candidate. Now, sometimes they would get one representative in Congress out of East Tennessee.
Right.
But Middle Tennessee and West Tennessee, it was the Democratic primary. That's the only thing that counted, because the Republicans were still hated for what they had done to the South during the war.
Forrest also gets a bad rap in a lot of ways. I mean, when the war was over, when it was done, he was all about reconciliation. Let's reunite the country. And he was more than fair with the blacks. And he wanted to see them succeed, not succeed, but see them to be successful and be treated.
That's okay too. That's all right.
He wanted them to be treated fairly.
Yeah.
But he doesn't get any credit for that.
He caught all kind of hell about that.
Yeah.
When he was head of that Memphis, Mobile, and Memphis, Marion, and Selma Railroad they were trying to build after the war, he hired blacks. And he was paying the blacks the same thing he was paying the whites. And he caught all kind of grief about that. and said, you can't do that. These were people that were traitors against us. They were collaborators with the enemy. He said, hey, they're doing the same work. Why shouldn't they get the same amount of money? So,
Right.
then they try to paint him as some horrible monster, racist person that, hated black people. He was asked to be the keynote speaker at a national convention of the Order of Pole Bearers, which is a black organization, the forerunner of the NAACP.
Right.
This is after the war. There was no slavery anymore. Right. And they went out of their way to ask him to come and speak to their national convention. Now, if he was such a terrible person, why would they ask him to come and speak to them at their convention? And he was an honored guest. So, too many people today get their history off The View or CNN.
Yeah.
And
they get the Whoopi version of history, the Whoopi or the Oprah. And the other thing too is he was during the war. A lot of I think he gave some of his slaves the choice of, okay, look, if you ride with me, then at the end you'll be free. He said, you're going to be free one way or the other. If we lose, you're going to be free. If we win, I'm going to give you. But they rode with him. I think only one ever left him during that whole time frame.
You're exactly right, Dave. At the start of the war, he had called his slaves together, the males, and said, look, we need teamsters, we need blacksmiths, we need harness makers, carpenters, same thing you're doing on the farms and plantations. You stay with us during the course of the war, and just like you said, regardless of the outcome of the war, I'll guarantee you'll get your freedom. And about the third time he got shot, he called them together and he said, boys, I don't think I'm going to make it to the end of the war, but I promised Mrs. Forrest I'd give you your freedom. You're free to go now. But we really need your help, and we'd appreciate it if you'd stick it out with us. And just like you said, 44 out of the 45 stayed with him. And I've heard people say, oh, well, they were behind Confederate lines. They couldn't go anywhere. Those people don't know anything about Forrest. He spent as much time behind the Union lines as he did behind the Confederate lines on raids. Right. And they could have simply walked down a half a mile and been in the federal territory then.
Wasn't his personal guard, weren't
Yep.
they made up of his slaves as well?
His escort company. Yes, sir. And some of the people that rode with him were blacks. And if he was so terrible, they had any opportunity any night to just go in and slit his throat. Yeah. Forrest Escort Company was an interesting organization. Back then, a general could have an escort company, 100 men, and usually it was son-in-laws, nephews, sons of friends, and they got fancy uniforms and trotted around with the general back where it was real safe. So, right. Not in Forrest Command. The escort company were like the shock troops, like Green Berets or the Marine Reconnaissance or Special Ops. And when a battle was going back and forth and they needed a lightning bolt to hit right at the most crucial part of the battlefield, he sent his escort company in there. Many of them were black. And I've seen photographs of reunions they've had, and they had white guys. Here's 2 or 3 blacks, another row of white guys, 2 or 3 blacks. So blacks served in his escort company. Yep. And that was a tough organization. Most of them were teenagers. When you're a teenager, you think you're going to live forever. So that's the kind of people they wanted in that. Yeah. And they started out with 100, and during the course of the war, they went through 263.
Wow.
They had that many of them killed off.
Wow.
So,
any closing thoughts or anything you want to let anybody know about coming up at Chapel Hill?
Well, yes, sir. At the Forrest home every year, the 3rd Saturday in June, which will be the 20th in 2026, 20th of June, we have our homecoming event out at the Forrest home. And we have infantry, artillery, and cavalry reenactors out in the field. We have historical speakers. We have musical entertainment. We have about 50 or 60 vendors that are selling flags, books, bakeware, baked goods, whatever. And it goes from 9 in the morning till about 4 in the afternoon. And all the proceeds go to the restoration and maintenance of the Forrest home. So we invite everybody to come out. It gets to be like a big family reunion. We see that a lot of the same people every year that come back from Kentucky and Alabama and different parts of Tennessee just to be there. And it's a very pro-Southern event. And we're not ashamed of it. We fly our flags. It's our history. And we feel like we have as much right to our history as the Muslims you were talking about earlier on the program, or Gay Pride Month, or Black History Month, or Hispanic Month, or anything like that. we feel like that's our history. And we're proud of those men that stood to defend the South against a brutal, sadistic enemy.
Absolutely. Well, hey, thanks for being with us. We'll definitely have you back on. We talked earlier, you're a Vietnam veteran, and so we're going to get you back on sometime probably in January and do a veteran show with you.
Yes, sir. Be glad to do that.
Thanks again. Our
Yes,
second
sir.
show tonight is at 8:30 p.m. Central is with Don Nobles Gorham of the Gorham Homestead in Dixon. Hope you all join us for that as well. I want to thank the audience for taking the time to watch our program tonight. It doesn't cost anything to subscribe, so please be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons, as well as the notification bell so you never miss an episode. We appreciate your support. Thanks again to Jonathan and Mary for their financial support from July throughout. These people, they have been great. They have made a huge difference for our show. We really appreciate it. Check out our audio podcasts on iHeartRadio, Spotify, and other platforms as well. Sign up for our weekly newsletter at our website, teeninformer.com. Find and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Tuesday, December 2nd at the Jefferson County Library, David Seal. Tuesday, December 2nd at the Jefferson County Library, David Seal will be hosting legislative training. This is important information that everyone should know so that you can effectively track legislation during the upcoming session. The Stewart Henry chapter of the Tennessee Firearms Association will meet this Thursday, December 4th, 7 p.m. at the Holly Park Shooting Facility outside Paris, Tennessee on Highway 79. You don't have to be a member to attend, but you can learn how to be heard by your legislature on protecting your right to keep and bear arms. Our guest next week will be on December 8th. First guest will be former Marine and Army veteran and a former Nashville undercover police officer. He was a 7th District congressional candidate during the primary, Joe Lewers. He's going to join us to talk about the special election and more. Our second show next week, we will have Kerry Wolowitz. He joins to tell us the other story of Buford Pusser. He has some serious issues with claims made by Mike Elam on this show a few weeks ago, and so we're going to have him on to hear the other story. Like Mike, he is not originally from here and has done his own research. It should be interesting. If you're in the 7th District, remember, you got to vote tomorrow. We've got to keep the commie out. Hope you can join us next week. That's it for now. Good night from Paris, Tennessee, that is.